Podcast 9, Motown and Soul Music and Girl Groups. These are three styles of music that are really very similar. They have a lot of similarities in the way the music is conceived and produced. But there are subtle differences that I'm hoping that after this course you'll be able to hear one of these songs and be able to identify what style it is. Is it a Motown song, soul tune, or is it one of these girl groups that Kovac identifies? So we're going to break down each of these into some detail, look at stylistic differences and stylistic similarities, and also what holds all these together, in that they have a strong connection with a style of music that we haven't discussed yet called doo-wop. And so we're going to start there with doo-wop. Most people think of doo-wop as Blue Moon or some of those great hits from the 1950s that are vocally very heavy. But doo-wop has a longer tradition, and as you know from this class, I like to look at the root genres. And so when we look at this music, before we get into what it's all about, we should know that this music has its origins in gospel, black gospel music, and white gospel music, the rhythm and blues, which has its origin in the blues. But it also has another element to it, and that is that it shares a kinship with barbershop quartet music. If you've never heard barbershop quartet music, you need to open up a window, go to the Rock and Roll History YouTube page, and locate the playlist called Doo-Wop, where you'll see an example of a barbershop quartet tune. And you'll notice when you listen to this that it's all about tight, coordinated vocal harmony. Four men singing in four-part harmony. And we'll go into a little bit more about that later. But we should also know that this music has, this doo-wop style has its origins in the East Coast urban African-American neighborhoods. Perhaps it's called doo-wop music because that's what it sounds like at times. Odd syllables put together to form grooves and patterns. Doo-wop, doo-wop, doo-wop. And this, what these singers are really doing is taking the place of the rock band or the band, the instrumental accompaniment. And so the voice can, in many voices at once, can take the place. Now, when you take this doo-wop style, which has no instruments and only musicians that are singers taking the place of instruments, and you pair that up with a rock band, you get a rock and roll genre called doo-wop, and we'll listen to some of that later on the YouTube site. Let's take a look at three terms that you need to know. A cappella. This simply means no instruments, so voice only. Four-part harmony. If you have four singers, each sings a note, you have four-part harmony. And then I'm going to teach you a little bit about one of the progressions of chords that you hear in these songs typically. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. Let's begin with our chord progression explained. Let's go to the piano now and listen to a chord progression that's very common in 1950s doo-wop songs. Let's listen to the chord progression and then we'll talk about it. Remember that a chord is three notes or more sounding simultaneously, and a chord progression is a series of chords that are put together that form the underlying instrumental accompaniment for the song. This chord progression is a little bit different than your typical chord progression in early rock and roll because of the fact it includes some interesting chords called seventh chords. Seventh chords have 4 notes, and seventh chords are common in jazz. And so this music style, because the harmony is a little bit more interesting, it has that connection with its earlier predecessor called jazz. Now that you've heard the chord progression, you can go to the YouTube website and listen to Blue Moon. And I think that you'll hear this chord progression played over and over again. Also, if you ever played Heart and Soul on the piano, you know this chord progression just as well. Most beginning pianists are taught this song by one of their friends, and it goes like this. Heart and Soul is one of these famous tunes. This progression is a little simpler than the doo-wop progression I played. However, it's very similar. Now, a doo-wop group in an urban neighborhood might gather on a hot summer afternoon and just sing songs. And one or more singers will take the lead role and sing the lyrics while the others sing harmony. And so it's sort of like a pastime. And neighborhoods had doo-wop groups, just like neighborhoods have neighborhood gangs. The barbershop quartet will feature men that have different vocal ranges. You might have 2 tenors, or men that can sing higher, then baritone, a man who can sing somewhere in the middle, and then the bass. That guy sings the lowest. And this makes sense. Now we have all the ranges of the male voice covered. In the same way that in a rock band, the guitar and the piano will typically play mid-range. The bass, of course, plays the lowest notes, and you might have a saxophone or a singer singing pitches higher than that. And by having this stratified texture, or these layers, the music sounds really thick and really tight. Let's go to the YouTube channel, if you already haven't, and listen to some barbershop quartet, specifically the Macedonia Quartet with Sweet Little Girl of Mine. This looks to be a 78. Follow that up with a doo-wop example from the mid-1950s by the Ink Spots. The Ink Spots were one of the first groups to cultivate this style and begin to integrate it into popular music. And the example I chose is called Don't Laugh at Me. Follow that up with Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, Why Do Fools Fall in Love? And when you're done with that, if you haven't heard the chords shaboom, that'll knock your socks off and really pull this all together as far as rock and roll and this emerging doo-wop style in the 1950s. I'd like to talk a little bit about shaboom. Listen to it again, this time really turn it up or put headphones on, and you'll really hear the intricate detail that this song features in terms of the vocals. The frontman is free to explore and express the lyrics, and the backup group just forms real tight harmony, and they use this word shaboom over and over again as the instrumental accompaniment. Now, that's paired up quite clearly with electric guitar and a rock drum beat. When you listen to it, notice that the second verse has the front man goes off on absolute nonsense syllables. Delang, 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 and this is something else that is common in this doo-wop style. If you don't know the words, you just stick with the melody and kind of improvise with syllables. Now, in jazz music, this is called scat, where the front man or front singer, lead singer, will just sing a solo, imitating instruments. It's an excellent and very effective technique because the front man, in this case, can, through improvisation, kind of flex his or her improvisational muscles. You'll notice in the third section of the song, the bass voice comes in and takes a solo. And this is another feature of this music that you might have the frontman drop to the accompaniment and have another singer take over on the melody. And this is a great way to show the diversity that your group features. There's a killin' saxophone solo in this tune. And the saxophone solo, to me, sounds like it's been directly transported from jazz music. The way that the sax player is syncopating the beat, it's really hard to figure out just exactly what rhythm he's playing. He explores quite a range of pitches on the instrument. We have pitch sliding. The saxophone melody is clearly related to the tune, and it's a real nice touch. I think this is probably one of the best examples of rhythm and blues paired up with doo-wop singing style. And when you think about it, if you really listen to the lyrics, you're left wondering what shaboom really means. Now we move on to Motown. Motown is the type of music that was coming out of Detroit, Michigan in the 1960s. Sometimes Motown is called Hitsville, USA, and this is because outside of the house Berry Gordy purchased after he experienced a certain amount of success, he had his house labeled Hitsville, USA. And if you haven't gone there, you should go and catch a Detroit Tigers game while you're there. But it's a very interesting museum now, and there's actually two houses, and you can see all of this history where all this great music that you know, I'm sure you know, came from. But you should know that Berry Gordy was the chief creative officer, not specifically with that title, but he was the creative impetus behind all the great songs that are part of the Motown tradition. Berry Gordy had a philosophy that included recruitment of musicians from poor black neighborhoods in Detroit. And many of these musicians were familiar with this doo-wop style, but they most certainly knew the black gospel music and the rhythm and blues that was popular in the 1950s. Berry Gordy, when he put together these groups or recorded these groups, he painstakingly had them learn coordinated dance moves that were really tight. And you'll be able to see this. I've selected live video where it was available for the examples of Motown. But these, in many cases, young black women that got a shot recording music with Berry Gordy, these young black women had not been included for the most part in the success of rhythm and blues because it's a male-driven music. And so this is a big difference in history here. And women that were successful with Berry Gordy in Hitsville, USA, wound up on television. And this theme of women emerging on the pop scene goes hand in hand with the social justice movement of the 1960s. Whether a band features men or women, the one characteristic that we see out of Motown is the strong use of the front man, which is typical with the doo-wop music. And the other vocalists simply will provide backup accompaniment. One style trait of Berry Gordy's Motown songs is this really clean and smooth approach to the vocals, especially the backup vocals. There's a tendency for the frontman to distinguish him or herself by having somewhat of a sense of improvisation, but the rest of the backups are absolutely planned and very, very carefully and painstakingly rehearsed until they were of the quality that Berry Gordy felt represented Motown Records. Now, also emerging out of the 1960s is a little business called McDonald's Hamburgers. And in the 1950s and 1960s, businesses selling products wanted to make sure that every time they sold a product that was advertised on TV, that wherever you go in the country, or perhaps in the world for that matter, when you get that product, you know it's exactly what you think it's going to be based on what you've purchased before, what you were told it would be like on television. McDonald's is a very good example of that, because if you go and get a Big Mac in Texas and then you get a Big Mac in, for instance, New York City, it's going to be the same Big Mac. It's got the same special sauce, the same 2 patties, and the same buns. And this branding, this ability to have quality control throughout the production, wherever it is something that Berry Gordy had adopted as well. Ford and Chevrolet had been doing it earlier than that, and this is nothing new that a company wants to have quality control and replication. But here, Berry Gordy was attempting to do this in the studio. And so, in order to make sure that the musical instrumental accompaniment was always has the same sound, he used what's called a house band. And his house band was called the Funk Brothers. And these guys had a horn section. They could play all the instruments, and they could cover all the parts. And so because the Funk Brothers laid down all the tracks in the studios for bands like artists like the Temptations, the Four Tops, Martha and the Vandellas, and so forth, their music has a similar type of quality to it. The songs are enough different that they're distinct, but it's that core group of musicians that does the recording. Now, one of the things that the Funk Brothers are known for is laying down tight bass lines and catchy grooves. That's one of the things that you're going to hear in this music. Also, the use of the tambourine, quite common. The tambourine is something that a singer can play easily because they're not distracted by moving lots of fingers and controlling an instrument. And so you're going to hear use of the tambourine more frequently in this music. Now, when the Temptations or the Supremes went out on tour, this poses a certain kind of a problem, because the Funk Brothers would stay back at the studio, and so when they went on tour, they would have to get pickup bands that could play well enough that they could hold these tunes down. So it's interesting. When we talk about the Temptations, we're really talking about the guys that made up the vocal core of the group, or the Supremes, the vocal core of the group, whereas the band is not mentioned in this case. This is much different from bands today, where a band is a group of musicians that usually doesn't change as they go from show to show. When it comes to lyrics in Berry Gordy and Motown, one of the things that we notice is that there's an incredible optimism, and Berry Gordy rarely uses overt sexual overtones or innuendos in this music. The music is packaged to be sold to mainstream America, and so in doing so, he knows that there's certain things that you can and cannot do effectively if you want your music to be wildly popular, like some of the other late 1950s acts that we discussed earlier. You should know this lineup of major hit Motown acts: Temptations, the Supremes, the Four Tops, Stevie Wonder, and Martha and the Vandellas. Let's go to the website now, the YouTube website, and listen to some of this music. Start your audio adventure with the Temptations, The Way You Do the Things You Do. This is an excellent example of this. I don't know where this video clip is taken from, but it's really interesting. It almost looks like a rehearsal for a television program. But here you can see the four guys that make up the backup vocals, and you can see how they interact with the front man. The front man stands away from the group of guys that are all crowded around the microphone. You can see the backup guys have a real tight dance routine that they're executing at the same time the song is going on. It's hard to see the band in this video. Who could forget the Supremes and Baby Love? You can see here that the three girls are impeccably dressed. This is by no mistake. This is part of the act. This is part of Berry Gordy's product. And you can see that these young black women have hairstyles that are more similar and more in tune with mainstream American young white hairstyles. And in this case, the lead singer has the microphone, and the others are just, they're there, but you can really see that the lead is on Diana. The Four Tops, I Can't Help Myself, another example. You can see live, the band is nowhere to be seen, but it's the same setup that essentially the Temptations have, but they're not quite as skilled with the dance moves. Martha and the Vandellas Dancing in the Street is another outstanding example of this music. You can really hear the horns in this tune. It's a little better recording, but once again, they're wearing evening gowns. They're impeccably dressed, and you can see this is the Ed Sullivan Show, and this is in color here. I'm not sure what year this was, but that doesn't really matter so much. The effect of the video clearly shows how this music act is functioning. The last example I've included in the playlist is Uptight, Everything's Alright. If you don't know this song, it's from 1966, and it's Stevie Wonder, and it's a fantastic example of the big fat horn sound that was coming out of Motown in the mid-1960s. The lyrics to this song match very well up with the instrumental accompaniment. It's upbeat, it's exciting, it's optimistic, and this is exactly what I was talking about with lyrics in this music. Let's move on now to the brill-building girl groups, as Kovac identifies them. This music comes out of the major music industry, as we've described them, big music. And the production of American popular music changed little in the 1960s, which is, to me, absolutely amazing, because although they were trying to react to the constantly changing environment in rock and roll, they never really changed their approach. And that approach involves having songwriting teams write hits, and then they would choose performers to perform those hits and then market the records through means that have been discussed. This slide shows 3 songwriting teams that were wildly successful in writing music for the girl groups of the 1960s. King and Goffin, Sedaka, Greenfield, Vile, and Mann. Neil Sedaka himself went on to record quite a few hits, and Carole King is the Carole King you remember from the 1970s and her famous duets with fellow songwriter James Taylor. The recording of this music is done by the producer. Now, we talked about the producer in terms of the Beatles. We've talked about Berry Gordy. He was a producer, but one of the most important producers in all of rock history was Phil Spector. Phil Spector in the early 1960s developed a technique of recording that has come to known as the wall of sound. And basically, the wall of sound, he packs as many instruments as he can into a recording. And in doing so, the recording is very dense and very tightly packed. And when he does this, it's not unusual for him to layer the sound such that there's sound from high-pitched instruments all the way down to baritone saxophone, which is one of the lowest instruments that you hear in rock and roll. It can really growl down there. But in using all these instruments, including the full orchestra, and cramming all these people into one room and having them do these recordings, he is able to create this kind of sound. He also used technology available to him to the fullest, in the same way that the Beatles attempted to do this in their experimental and revolutionary periods, 1960s, mid-1960s. But Phil Spector was doing this before the Beatles. We should note that Phil Spector also produced the album Let It Be, which is the final Beatles album, 1971, which is something that John Lennon was really upset with. But that's another story. Now, in terms of Motown and style, the music is not much different, really. The songs are clean. They feature a lead female singer and then backup, and they have dance routines, and they're groomed. They're taught etiquette. They come from modest backgrounds with little formal training, but it's interesting to me that this industry reaction to what Berry Gordy was doing in Motown, how these producers focused on young women. And they did this because of the fact that this is an open market, and they know through marketing research that they're going to be able to sell records to this market, and they wouldn't have done this had this not been the case. Now, this is much different than what Bob Dylan was doing, where he was writing pretty much anything he wanted to, and it just happened to be that he attained a certain amount of success doing what he was doing. Whereas here, the artists kind of stumble into it, if you will, through talent auditions. One major difference, however, between this music and Motown is there seems to be a wide use of orchestral instruments in this music, not relegated to a saxophone and brass like you heard from the Funk Brothers, especially with the tune Uptight, but with Phil Spector's Wall of Sound, and having this brand, they used strings prolifically. And I think that because the music has an element that's more closely connected to mainstream pop, that's one of the reasons why it was so popular. This music it's very safe. The lyrics are designed to be catchy around puppy love type of themes. A very good example of this is the Ronettes' Da Do Run Run. It's a fantastic song. It's very well put together. But when you hear the lyrics, you'll notice that it's about nothing, really. It's about nothing other than puppy love. And so you know exactly who that record is being marketed to. Nostalgically, we listen to some of these songs and oftentimes don't think about the fact that when they were released with the hopes of captivating America and selling records. Take a look at this brill-building lineup. The Shirelles, the Crystals, the Chiffons, the Angels, the Dixie Cups. I find it very interesting that these group names are very feminine in a way. For instance, the Angels, I think that's very clear. The Chiffons, and the Dixie Cups. Very, very interesting. Let's start our listening odyssey with the first video on the playlist called Stupid Cupid. This is a Carole King, Barry Goffin song. Notice 1959 is the date that this was released. Connie Francis, this song shows that before the 1960s, this teen idol music was already going on. But we're going to hear that this music, this song in particular, is really novel and really quite trite. And then we're going to hear when Phil Spector starts producing, you're going to hear a radical change to a bigger kind of a sound in the recording, that wall of sound technique we heard. You can listen to Kooky Kooky, Lend Me Your Comb, also Connie Francis, or you can skip it. The Crystals' Da Do Run Run is a very important song for you to listen to cover to cover. This song has a tremendous amount of energy in it. And the song is about how a boy makes a girl excited. And you even find out his name was Bill. But when you listen to this, think in terms of Phil Spector. He's really trying to create, like we talked about with the Beatles, a sound image. And if you think about, listen to the energy in the piano part, and think about that as if it were a heartbeat. And you can almost feel it racing. And that's what makes this song incredibly exciting. One of Phil Spector's most important songs was You've Lost That Loving Feeling, as recorded by the Righteous Brothers. Here, there's no group. There's just two of them. There's one lead and one backup. And this is a very interesting song. You're going to hear the use of orchestral instruments. And the end of the song is very interesting and very powerful in how there's a breakdown of the music, and the outro is very elaborate. And when they bring back the lyric, You've Lost That Loving Feeling, it's very powerful. This was a huge hit in the 1960s. Next, we go on to soul. Soul music is a music that was cultivated by Atlantic Records in New York City. And Atlantic Records has been around for a long time, recording music of black artists. And in the 1950s, they made a lot of money selling rhythm and blues records. One of the key players, one of the key talents at Atlantic Records was Jerry Wexler. And Jerry's job was to find artists to record. And he looked for artists at independent labels and then brought them over to Atlantic, where they were turned into hits. One of the places he looked for independent artists was at Stax Records. You can read more about Stax in the Kovac text, but you should know that Stax Records was located in Memphis, Tennessee, and Jerry Wexler would go down to Stax, find artists, and then draw them back to Atlantic Records. And of course, Stax got a cut of that. You remember the story about how Elvis Presley left Sun Records. At a certain point, an independent label has to weigh whether or not they can continue to support an artist. And if a major player from a major record label comes along and says, hey, I'll offer you this much money for the contract, then, the decision in some cases, in the case of Stax, this decision is fairly easy to make. But it's interesting, the location, Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee. We learned that Memphis, Tennessee was a draw for Southern musicians, and this was absolutely true. It was just a stopping point for some musicians on their way to New York City, where they would record for Jerry Wexler and Atlantic Records. Let's take a look at the style of this music. Now, you've listened to, I hope by now, if you've done the study guide, the example by Ben E. King called Stand By Me. Maybe you've heard it anyway. This song is an example of soul, but it's a specific type. It's sweet soul. It's mellow. It's improvisational, but it's by and large a very pop kind of a music style. Now, soul, as it's called, is much different. Soul music is very expressive, and it's more similar to, as Kovac says, the music in the gospel church, where there's a tremendous amount of improvisation to the almost going to the point of shouting. And you're going to notice this, but the shouts and the moans and the growls are musical gestures that the artist uses to express the mood of the song. Soul is much different than Motown, however, because the rhythm and the instruments take the accompaniment to a whole nother extreme. And you're going to hear in this music that there's something called the delayed backbeat. This is where where the backbeat is so to the edge of the beat that it's almost on the next beat. And so if you can think about a beat being a space in time, you can hit a note directly on the beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can hear how delayed and late I'm making that. And this is a trait of soul style. And by utilizing this effect of the backbeat, the musicians would lay down grooves or repetitive rhythms that persist through a section or through an entire song. The house band, in the same way that Motown used Funk Brothers, Wexler was using a band called Booker T and the MGs, and Booker T was an organ player, and then he surrounded himself with a full horn section and the rest of the elements of the rock band. Booker T and the MGs are known for their radical backbeats and grooves, and as you'll hear in the music, horn blasts. This is where a group of horns will just hit one note or a chord, and sometimes this is called horn stabbing, but it's quite startling, and it's a fantastic effect, and it's an effect that's going to evolve as soul music begins to evolve into another style called funk. One thing I find amazing about this music is when they recorded this music, in order to keep it fresh, they would just record it once or twice or maybe 3 times, and they'd take the best of the 3, and that was it. That's the recording that they put on the record and sold. And this is much different than what Phil Spector was doing and what Berry Gordy was doing, where they would rehearse and rehearse and rehearse, and then when they did the recording session, they knew exactly what it would sound like, and there would be a few issues. Or they would record the tune many, many, many times and then take the best recording after listening to all of them painstakingly. Here's a lineup of artists that Kovacs seems to focus on: Sam Cooke, Otis Redding, Aretha Franklin, and James Brown. Let's go to the Soul playlist now, and let's open that up and listen to some of this music. You can listen to a few of these. Wilson Pickett in the Midnight Hour is a fantastic example of this. Otis Redding, R-E-S-P-E-C-T. This is a tune that we probably most commonly hear performed by Aretha Franklin, but listen to Otis Redding sing this tune. Then go on to James Brown. Papa's Got a Brand New Bag. He has a timeline for this, but to really get this style and to really understand what this is like, you got to listen to the song I Feel Good by James Brown. And you may have heard this song before, but listen to it again and think about what I've talked about with the horns and the beat. And you're going to notice that the musicians are so tight. They can anticipate exactly where notes should be, and you can hear that they actually go off of the meter and into space and time that is only understood by them. And I wish I could produce that for you legally here, but I can't. So you'll have to listen to it and get a feel for what this is like with the horns. Now listen to the 1967 recording of R.E.S.P.C.T. as recorded by Aretha Franklin. Now this is about the best example that you can get when it comes to this music style, I think. James Brown's fantastic too, but this recording, now think about this. The first release of this was Otis Redding. Now we have a woman releasing the same song, and when you turn it around, because there's ownership of the lyrics, when you turn it around like that in the middle of the social justice movement where women's rights was a hot issue, the song means something completely different, especially as an African-American artist. This song is a huge hit, and it's not just a hit because it's a great song. It's a hit because of what it meant at the time it was released, and that's something that you should understand, that the connection to the social justice movement with the song originally sang by a man, but now turned around, it has that effect of being significant. Let's wrap this up and take a look at some concluding thoughts. First of all three of these styles come from a vocal music tradition. All three of these styles are related to gospel music and singing in church. All three of these styles have some connection to doo-wop in that they involve a lead singer and backup vocals that are oftentimes singing oohs and ahs or nonsensical syllables, which is what doo-wop is. All three of these styles are a form of musical entertainment. All three of these styles involve dance. Think about James Brown and what you saw from him. Think about what you saw with the Shirelles. Think about what you saw with respect to the Temptations. This music is meant to be performed. It's meant to be on TV. It's meant to sell lots of records. But the one thing that really stands out in terms of what's related here to all three of these music styles is the sense of precision that is brought to the recording process by the producer. Now, when it comes to Berry Gordy and the Brill Building examples, the girl groups, that's highly rehearsed and highly thought out before the recording happens. Whereas the soul examples out of Atlantic Records, they may have rehearsed, but they didn't record over and over and over again. They simply recorded it a few times, did a few takes, and then that's the song. So we have that difference amongst these groups. It's also true that these groups were representing labels, and so the artists were expected to be clean cut, clean shaven, and were expected to conduct themselves with a certain amount of respect back to the music industry that is supporting them. Now that changed over time with James Brown, but this is true that these artists, there's a certain code of conduct that they are to uphold to maintain their contracts. Finally, all three of these styles feature vocal core groups or artists that do not require the need for a band. They can simply go on tour and have a pickup band form in major cities. That's all for this podcast, and I hope that after hearing this music and understanding that there are three different areas of music in the 1960s, three very popular areas that we hear at weddings and on the radio and in movies and film as a nostalgia piece, that they're three very different styles. They couldn't be any more different. However, they have these interesting similarities, and I would imagine that now, after hearing some of this, you could probably identify which one it is that you're hearing. And sometimes that takes lots of examples, but many of us find that after just hearing a few, that it starts to come together and it starts to make sense. So go through your textbook and use the study guide to figure out which artists are the important ones to memorize, but know the basic style traits of each of the three areas, because test questions will be formulated based on what makes these different and what makes these similar. And then finally, be sure that you know all of the artists that were identified in the podcast. These artists are significant in terms of rock history when it comes to these three music styles. Thank you.